In the spring of 1517, in the market squares of central Germany, there stood a wooden box. It was iron-bound, chained to a trestle, and it had more than one lock. 2 in most towns, 3 in some, because the man who preached could not open it alone. 1 key belonged to a friar, 1 belonged to an officer of the archbishop, and 1 belonged to an employee of a bank. Not a symbol of a bank, an employee. A salaried man from the house of Fugger in Augsburg, who traveled with the preaching tour, stood beside the box while peasants dropped in coins to shorten their dead mother's suffering, and then counted the takings. The obvious guess is that he was there to stop the friar stealing. But he wasn't watching the friar. He was there because the money in that box was already spoken for. It had been pledged 3 years earlier against a loan. He had come to collect. Within 6 months of that box appearing, a professor of theology in a small Saxon town would write 95 sentences about it, and Western Christianity would split in half, permanently. 130 years of European war run downstream of it. So does the modern German language. So does the shape of the United States, and the map of every place where Catholics and Protestants killed each other. That much everyone knows, and everyone knows it as a story about faith. But the split had a repayment schedule. A young man wanted a job he couldn't afford. He borrowed the money from Europe's richest banker, and he serviced the loan by selling forgiveness on a commission split with the Pope's signature on the license. Now, you might expect the next half hour to be about whether indulgences were true. It isn't. That question is 400 years old, and I'm not going to settle it here. This is a film about indulgences as a product. Who designed it? Who priced it? Who distributed it? On what margin? And who got paid when? Because the medieval church built something extraordinary here, and I mean that the way an engineer means it. It located a source of supply that could never run out. It found a demand curve that doesn't bend to price. It solved distribution before anyone else in Europe had, before anyone in Europe was trying. And it invented tiered pricing 4 centuries before an economist gave it a name. Every one of those is a real commercial achievement. None of them is what killed it. What killed it was the one move that kills any company. It borrowed against next year's sales. We'll follow the money in a straight line, from the first customers in 1300 to the man with the key in 1517. But the line breaks the order most of us were taught, that the doctrine came first and the abuse crept in later. It's the other way round. The customers came first. The doctrine was written 43 years afterwards to explain a queue. Rome, the 22nd of February, 1300. Pope Boniface VIII issues a bull with a modest-sounding promise. Come to Rome this year. Confess. Visit the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul on 15 separate days. And the punishment owed for your sins, all of it, is remitted. Hold on that word. Punishment, not forgiveness. This is the thing modern viewers get wrong about indulgences, and everything else in this film depends on getting it right. Forgiveness was free. It always had been. You confessed, you were absolved, the guilt was gone, and the church never charged a penny for that, then or now. That part of the caricature is simply wrong. But absolution canceled the guilt, not the debt. The sin still owed something: fasting, pilgrimage, alms, and whatever you hadn't worked off by the time you died, you worked off in purgatory, not hell. Nobody is selling anything in hell, because hell is permanent. But purgatory is a sentence you serve and then leave, which means purgatory has a duration. And anything with a duration can be counted. Days, years. Once you can count it, you can discount it. And once you can discount it, somebody prices it. An indulgence was that discount. Not a license to sin, and not forgiveness, but time off a sentence. drawn against an account we'll come to shortly. Boniface was not the first pope to offer it. 2 centuries earlier, Urban II had offered the same release to anyone who marched on Jerusalem. A recruitment tool that worked so well, it emptied the nobility of France into a desert. But a crusade costs a knight everything he owns, and quite possibly his life. Boniface's version cost a journey. Rome expected a large pilgrimage. What arrived broke the city. Among the crowd was a young Florentine named Giovanni Villani. He became the chronicler of Florence later. In 1300, he was a banking man, whose profession was counting other people's money. 200,000 pilgrims in the city at any given moment, he wrote. All year, without a break. Orderly. Endless. He went home and began a history of the world, believing he had witnessed a spiritual event. He had witnessed the first mass consumer market in European history. The detail everyone repeats reaches us secondhand, and I'll flag that. At the altar of St. Paul's, 2 clerics are said to have stood day and night, all year, with rakes, the offerings arriving faster than hands could gather them. The rakes may be a story. The queue is not. Every account of that year, friendly and hostile, says the same thing. Rome had never seen money arrive like this, and for a long time afterwards it did not have to ask anyone for any. Boniface had gone looking for pilgrims. What he found was demand, and he had no theory for it. People who slept above their animals had walked 1,000 miles and handed over money they could not spare for a thing that cannot be seen, weighed, or verified. Any institution that stumbles onto a demand curve like that gets asked the same question. On what authority? It took 43 years to produce an answer. In January of 1343, Pope Clement VI issued a bull called Unigenitus Dei Filius. On its face, it is an administrative memo. It schedules the next jubilee for 1350, moving them from once a century to once every 50 years. A decision about frequency, which is to say a decision about revenue. But buried in the same document is the most consequential financial idea of the Middle Ages. Clement's argument runs like this. Christ's suffering was infinite, so the satisfaction it produced was infinitely more than the sins of the world required. The saints overpaid too, the martyrs especially. None of that surplus evaporates. It is held. There is a treasury. The word is his, thesaurus, a common store of merit belonging to the whole church, and the Pope holds the key to it. The theology isn't my point. The structure is. There is a reserve. It is denominated in something nobody can audit. Its stock is, by definition, infinite. There is exactly one authorized signatory, and he can issue claims against it at any volume he likes, without ever drawing it down. If you saw our earlier films, you know the Church spent 3 centuries arguing about whether money was permitted to breed, and ruled that it was not, because a coin is barren. Here's the part I didn't tell you. While it argued that, it had quietly minted a second currency, one that could breed, infinitely, at no cost, with a single issuer and no possibility of a run. They did not think of it that way. I'm certain of that. They believed they were describing something true about heaven. But intentions don't change balance sheets. 2 centuries from here, that reserve will have a printed price list, and for a laborer, the cheapest line on it will cost 1 week of his life. Hold on to that. What there wasn't yet was paper. A reserve is useless if the only way to draw on it is to walk to Rome. For a century and a half after Clement, that was the bottleneck. The Church had infinite supply and no branch network. Distribution was medieval, literally. A pilgrimage, a shrine, a particular altar on a particular day. The men who fixed it were not theologians. They were what we would now, uncharitably, call regional sales directors. The Latin was questor, in English, pardoners. Chaucer's portrait of one, peddling pig bones as saints' relics, was written while the trade was at its height, so nobody can claim the abuses were a secret. You would expect Rome to have shut them down. Rome licensed them. The most effective was a papal legate named Raymond Perotti. Through the 1480s and 90s, he ran campaigns across Germany with a competence that would embarrass a modern marketing department. Letters of authority, sermons, commissioners, accounts. Then he left, and behind him stayed local subagents who kept selling for years after his horses were out of sight. But his real advantage wasn't the preaching. It was a piece of stationery, the confessional letter. A printed form with a blank space into which a clerk wrote the buyer's name. It entitled the holder to choose his own confessor and to full remission at the hour of death. Portable, sealed, made out to a person. It sits in a chest at home for 30 years doing nothing. But on the night you are dying, somebody puts it into your hand. Some of those forms survive. What stops you is not the Latin. It's the handwriting. The body of the text is printed, uniform, industrial. Then there's a gap, and in the gap, in different ink, in a hurry, a clerk who never met him has written somebody's name. That gap is this entire film in 1 square inch of paper. For 400 years the sinner had to reach the shrine. Now the shrine arrived folded, for a fee. And Perotti could produce them in quantity because by then Germany had a machine. Here's a fact I would not believe if the surviving copies weren't sitting in libraries. When Gutenberg's press in Mainz began commercial work in the mid-1450s, one of its first mass products, run off in the thousands before the famous Bible was finished, was Indulgences. We tell ourselves the press began by liberating the Word of God. It began by filling in blanks on a form. That isn't a cheap irony. It's structural, and it comes back at the end of this film, and it does not come back gently. So by about 1500 the product is finished. Unlimited supply from Clement's treasury. Documented authority. Printed instruments with the buyer's name on them. A trained sales network working on commission. And yet, it still had a hard ceiling, because all of it only worked on the living. You confess, you are contrite, you pay, you receive. The transaction required a customer with a pulse, which capped the market at the size of the population, and the population had almost no money. The ceiling came off in 1476, and the moment it did, the arithmetic changed shape. The Church of Saint in western France needed building funds. Pope Sixtus IV granted an indulgence to raise them. Routine. It had been done hundreds of times. Except this grant carried a clause nobody had written before. The indulgence could be applied to the dead. Not to you, to someone already in purgatory. A mother, a child, a husband who died badly. You paid, and the remission was transferred to an account that was no longer yours. Theologically, Rome was careful. It was granted per modum suffragii, by way of intercession. The Church petitions God on the soul's behalf rather than commanding him. That distinction is real, and Catholic theologians will tell you, correctly, that it was never abandoned. It also survived the journey to the market square for roughly 10 minutes. Rome thought it was extending a mercy. What it had issued was a bearer instrument. Until 1476, the product was consumed by the buyer. After 1476, it is transferable. One person pays, a different person receives. That is the move that turns a private IOU into a bond you can hand to a stranger. But transferability isn't the worst of it, and this is the chapter that makes me angry. It moves the pitch off your fear and onto your love. Your own salvation you can gamble with. There's always time. You'll reform. You'll make the pilgrimage next year when the harvest is in. People are very good at deferring their own damnation. Your mother is already dead. She cannot wait for the harvest. Every day of delay is, on the church's own account, another day of fire for someone who cannot ask for help and cannot send word that she is fine. There is no price at which a decent person says no to that. Demand doesn't merely rise. It stops answering to price at all. And that property is not medieval. Every industry that sells against love still has it. Funeral directors know it. Care homes know it. The people who price a treatment a child needs know it. Nobody is a rational consumer when they are buying for someone who cannot ask. The church had found the one demand curve in economics that runs flat forever. And it isn't only love that does this. There is a market today worth billions in certificates stating that an invisible harm has been offset somewhere the buyer will never visit, verified by an intermediary he has never met, priced so that his behavior need not change. People have called those modern indulgences for 20 years, usually as an insult. Defenders of that market answer, fairly, that the accounting underneath is real, and that a flawed mechanism funding real work beats no mechanism at all. Hold that sentence. It is almost word for word what Rome said. And in 1476, it was also true. Within a few decades, indulgences for the dead were the backbone of every campaign in Northern Europe. It would be easy and lazy to end this chapter sneering at Sixtus. But the money built things: hospitals, bridges, universities. It also paid for a chapel in the Vatican that carries his name, the Sistine. Millions have queued for it, and every one of them stood in a room financed, in part, by people buying relief for their dead. That doesn't make it a fraud. It makes it the most successful public financing instrument in Europe before the government bond. And every successful instrument attracts the same eventual idea. Sooner or later, somebody pledges it as collateral. That happened in 1514, because a 23-year-old wanted a promotion. The easy reading of 1517 is that a corrupt church got greedy. The documents don't really support that. What they support is duller and worse: a young man with a cash flow problem. His name was Albrecht of Brandenburg, a Hohenzollern, younger brother of the Elector of Brandenburg. By 1513, at 23, he was already Archbishop of Magdeburg and administrator of the See of Halberstadt. Most men would have stopped there. Then Mainz fell vacant. On paper, Mainz was one more archbishopric. In practice, it was a throne. The Archbishop of Mainz sat as one of the 7 electors of the Holy Roman Empire, one of 7 men who chose the emperor. In raw political terms, one of the half-dozen most powerful offices in Europe. There were 2 problems. The first was canon law. Nobody was supposed to hold 3 sees at once, and certainly not at 23. But in 1514, that was barely a problem at all, because Rome sold dispensations, and it sold this one. The second problem was the price. Between the installation fee for Mainz and the dispensation for pluralism, the bill came to roughly 24,000 ducats. The surviving accounts differ by a few thousand depending on which fees you count. The shape of the deal does not. That was the annual income of a small principality, and Albrecht did not have it. His family had already paid heavily to put him into Magdeburg, and would not front it again. So the question in front of a 23-year-old with no money and one of the 7 most powerful offices in Europe on the table was a very modern one. What can he pledge? He borrowed. From Jakob Fugger of Augsburg. The richest man in Europe, the man who financed the election of the emperor himself, who ran the silver and copper mines of Central Europe, and whose bank had by then made the Medici look provincial. But Fugger did not lend against a promise. Fugger leant against a revenue stream. This is the moment the film has been walking towards, so hear the terms as they were written. Pope Leo X was rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica, begun by his predecessor, ruinously expensive, decades from finished, and he was funding it with a general indulgence. That indulgence had not yet been preached in Albrecht's territories, so the arrangement was this. Leo grants Albrecht the right to preach the St. Peter's indulgence across his provinces. Albrecht runs the campaign, and the proceeds are split down the middle. Half goes to Rome for the basilica. The other half goes to Jakob Fugger to service Albrecht's loan. Read that last part slowly. Half of every coin a German peasant paid to shorten his dead father's time in purgatory was assigned in advance, in writing, to a commercial bank in Augsburg as debt service on a loan taken out to buy a bishopric. Not stolen, not skimmed, not embezzled by some corrupt local official. Assigned, in writing, with the Pope's signature on the grant and the banker's clerk out on the road. That is why there was a Fugger man standing beside the box. He looked like an auditor, but he wasn't auditing anyone. He was the counterparty. And from here, everything follows with the logic of a machine. A loan has a repayment schedule, and a repayment schedule has no opinion about pastoral sensitivity. Somebody now had to go out and sell at volume against a deadline. Albrecht knew who to hire. Johann Tetzel was a Dominican friar, and by 1517 he had been selling indulgences for 2 decades. He was, by every account including the hostile ones, superb at it. You'd expect a hard sell. It wasn't. It was a liturgy. He arrived with a procession. The papal bull came in on a velvet cushion. A cross was planted in the middle of the square. Then came the sermon, and the sermon was not gentle. The line everybody knows is the jingle. As soon as the coin in the chest rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Did he say it? Luther says he heard it. Tetzel's defenders, then and since, insist he never used those words, and that his real preaching was more careful. I don't know, and neither does anyone else. But we don't need the jingle. We have the sales manual. In 1515, Albrecht's office issued the Instructio Summaria, a summary instruction for the commissioners and confessors running the campaign. It's an internal document. It was never meant for the crowd. It tells the sales force what to say, how to handle the confessional, how to account for the money. And it contains a price list. You might expect one price, or none, a donation, whatever a conscience could bear. But the manual is precise, and it is graded by rank. Kings, queens, archbishops, and princes, 25 gulden. 6 rungs down, ordinary townsmen and tradesmen, 1. And for the poor, who had nothing at all, prayer and fasting. In 1515, that latter is an astonishing piece of commercial thinking. The same product, at 25 times the price, to the man who can pay 25 times as much. Nobody rich is undercharged, and note, nobody poor is priced out. And this is not the seller responding to demand. Nobody on that ladder was haggling. A man who believes his mother is burning does not negotiate. Rome was not measuring what people were willing to pay. It had worked out what each rank was able to pay and set the line just underneath. Economists have a name for that, price discrimination, and the textbooks usually date it to the railways. It is sitting in a German ecclesiastical handbook 3 centuries before anybody called it a pricing strategy. And it never went away. 4 people in one row of the same aircraft paid 4 different fares. That is the Instructio Summaria, running on better hardware. You could read that bottom rung as generosity, a rate the poorest could reach. But 1 gulden was roughly a week's wages for a laborer. A week of a man's life for a sheet of paper on the day he was told his mother was still burning. He hands it over, believing he has bought his mother out of fire. What he has bought is one payment on somebody else's mortgage. Then the coin goes into the box, and the box is opened by 3 men at once. And now watch the one nobody watches, the Fugger clerk. He counts in front of witnesses. He writes the figure down. He seals the bag, and the bag goes to Augsburg, where the figure is entered a second time into the books of the best documented business in Europe. He looks like a functionary, but he is an accounting control, and he is the reason any of this can be said with confidence 400 years later. Because when the church stopped keeping records of this campaign, the bank did not. The money divides as the contract said it would. One half starts the journey to Rome. One half starts the journey to Augsburg. That machine ran for most of 1517, and it ran beautifully. But it made one routine mistake. It sold to people who lived 20 miles from a man already in a very bad mood. Tetzel was never allowed into Saxony. Frederick III of Saxony, Frederick the Wise, had banned the campaign from his lands. And before you file that under principle, understand why. Frederick had his own product. In the castle church at Wittenberg, he had assembled one of the largest relic collections in Europe. An inventory from 1518 lists over 17,000 items. A thorn from the crown, straw from the manger, milk of the Virgin, and attached to them, by papal grant, a published indulgence value. Viewed on the right day in the right order, 1,902,202 years off purgatory. Shown once a year to enormous crowds. The offerings funded his university. Frederick did not ban Tetzel to protect his people from indulgences. He banned Tetzel to protect his revenue from a competitor. But borders are porous, and a German peasant will walk 20 miles for a bargain. So Saxons crossed into Brandenburg and Anhalt, bought Tetzel's letters, and brought them home. And in the autumn of 1517 they began arriving in the confessional of a 33-year-old professor of biblical theology in Wittenberg, and presenting the letters instead of repentance. Martin Luther's problem, at the beginning, was not the Fugger loan. He knew nothing about the Fugger loan. Almost nobody did. His problem was pastoral, and it was much simpler. Men were coming to him unrepentant, holding receipts, and telling him they no longer required absolution because they had bought it. On the 31st of October, 1517, he did 2 things. The famous one is the door. Whether he hammered the 95 theses onto it or simply had them posted in the ordinary academic way is still argued over, and it's the least interesting question in the story. Nails or a notice board, the address is the same. The castle church at Wittenberg was Frederick's reliquary. It held the 17,000 relics, and their annual display, the biggest indulgence event in Saxony, fell on the 1st of November. All Saints' Day, the next morning. He posted a critique of the trade in remission on the door of the building that held Europe's largest inventory of it, on the eve of its busiest day of the year. That is not an academic gesture. That is a man nailing a complaint to the front of the shop. But the second thing he did on that day is the one that matters, and it is the one almost nobody remembers. He wrote a letter. A respectful, formal, deferential letter, enclosing the theses, addressed to the archbishop responsible for the campaign, appealing to him, as a bishop, to restrain the excesses of his preachers. He sent it to Albrecht of Mainz, which raises the question everybody skips. The letter was moderate, deferential, and on its face entirely reasonable. So why did the most powerful churchman in Germany do nothing with it? Luther thought he was writing to a shepherd about a scandal in his flock. He was writing to the debtor. He was writing to the one man in Germany who could not act on it, because the campaign was the repayment schedule on a loan of 20-odd thousand ducats from Jakob Fugger, with the Pope's own basilica taking the other half of the proceeds. Albrecht could have silenced Tetzel's worst sermons inside a week. He could not have stopped the selling. No argument, however good, however true, was going to move a man whose only alternative was default. Albrecht did not answer him. He forwarded the theses to Rome. And then the last piece falls, and it is the piece I promised you in Chapter 2. The 95 theses were written in Latin for scholars. Within weeks they had been translated, printed, and were circulating in every major city in Germany. Within 2 months they were across Europe. Nobody had ever seen an idea move like that. They moved on the printing press. The same technology, the same trade, in some towns very probably the same shops that had spent 60 years printing indulgence letters with a blank space for the buyer's name. Inside 2 years, the German printing industry had turned an obscure Saxon theologian into the most published author on the continent. The machine that had filled in the blanks now had a new product, and it sold better. The industry that distributed the goods also distributed the recall notice. And Thesis 86, the one that got repeated in the taverns because you didn't need a degree to understand it, went straight at the money. Why does not the Pope, whose wealth today is greater than the wealth of the richest Crassus, build this one basilica of St. Peter with his own money, rather than with the money of poor believers? Nobody in Rome produced an answer to that. Not because it was theologically difficult, because by 1517, the basilica was not being paid for out of a treasury at all. It was being paid for out of a sales campaign, and the campaign already had a second owner. Here is how it ended, and the timeline is worth having straight. Rome expected the noise to die down. Instead, the sales died. Not everywhere at once, but in the German heartland of the campaign, and fast. Within a year, the preaching tours were meeting hostile crowds rather than paying ones. And this is the thing the story never gets called. A lender held security over a stream of income, and inside 12 months, that stream was destroyed. That is a default. It is the only default in history that produced a new religion. Tetzel was disowned, blamed for the campaign by the institution that hired him. He died in 1519, isolated, 2 years after the market square. By tradition, Luther, who had every reason to hate him, wrote to him near the end, telling him not to take it too hard. The child had a different father. And then, the part that decides how you feel about all of it. Albrecht kept the archbishopric. He also kept the debt for the rest of his life. The house of Fugger was untouched. It went on financing emperors for another century. The church took the loss. St. Peter's was finished in 1626, 120 years after the first stone. It is one of the most beautiful things human beings have built. It also cost half of Western Christendom. The church did issue a recall. Look at what it recalled. In 1563, the Council of Trent ordered the entire office of the quaestor, the pardoner, the salesman, abolished, everywhere, permanently. 4 years later, Pope Pius V canceled every indulgence that involved a fee of any kind. But not the doctrine. The doctrine was reaffirmed in the same breath and remains Catholic teaching today. Indulgences exist. One can be obtained this year. They simply cannot be bought. No price, no ladder, no commissioner on margin. So the product was never withdrawn. The price tag was, and the sales force with it. That is what a recall looks like in any century. Nobody concedes the thing was wrong. They remove the part that was making money. And the other side deserves its best sentence here, not its worst. A Catholic historian would tell you, on firm ground, that nothing in this film shows forgiveness being sold, because forgiveness was never for sale. That the money was an alms, and the grant was attached to the alms. That no payment could touch an unrepentant soul, and Tetzel's own manual says so. And that the proof the institution knew the difference is that it destroyed the sales network and kept the teaching. That is not a weak argument, but whether it survives contact with a printed price list graded by rank is a different question, and that one is yours. So, the box in the market square, with its 3 locks. I said at the start it was chained shut because 3 men had to agree. That's true. It's also the wrong way round. The locks weren't protecting the money from thieves. They were there because the contents were spoken for before a single coin went in, by 3 parties, each of whom had to be present to count what they were owed. The church, the archbishop, the bank. Everyone standing in that square believed they were at a religious event. Strip out the language and the mechanism is bare. They were queuing at the collection point of a securitized revenue stream, buying a transferable instrument priced by social rank, proceeds split 50-50 between a building project and a commercial creditor. How many of them do you think would have paid if the friar had read out the terms? And the easy version of this story is that a cynical church defrauded simple people. I don't think the documents show that. Clement believed in his treasury. Tetzel, as far as I can tell, believed his own sermons. Albrecht wanted a job. Fugger wanted repayment. Nobody here had to be a villain. It required no malice at all. Only an institution discovering that it could sell something invisible, and then borrowing against the sales. And notice what nobody in it ever attacked. Luther in 1517 was not trying to abolish indulgences. Read the theses. He is trying to reform them. He went after the salesman, not the shop. So did Trent. Pius V went after the price. For 200 years, everyone attacked the loophole rather than the wall it was cut through. But there was a man, 1 generation later, in a cold city on a lake, who looked at the oldest financial prohibition in Christianity, the one this whole series has been circling, and did the thing nobody had dared. He didn't find a way around the wall. He argued that the wall should never have been built. It had been a sin for 1,000 years. He is the reason it stopped being one, and the reason there is an interest rate printed on your bank statement this morning. That film is on your screen now. But before you go, the verdict on this one is yours, and I want it. Was the indulgence trade a fraud that happened to build cathedrals? Or was it the most honest product ever sold? A system that finally printed a price on something everyone was already paying for in fear. I've shown you the ledger. I can't tell you what it means. Comments are open, and I read them.